In this video, we're going to be starting our unit on data and statistics. So this particular video here is about how we classify and collect data. It's going to be involving a bit of definition writing. So you're going to be doing a bit of writing, and over the next few lessons, we'll get into a bit more detail in regards to how we find data and how we gather it in that regards. But this first video is more of an introduction, just explaining how we collect and sort of categorize data. So the KUDs, what you need to understand, know, and do are the following. So you need to understand that there are different types of data, so make sure you're writing this down. You also know how to, will be able to classify data, and you've got to know the meaning of the following four things. So you need to make sure you know the meaning of numerical and categorical data, primary and secondary data sources. You also need to make sure you know the meaning of sample and census. So at the end of the video, come back and make sure you can answer all of those learning goals. So let's start off with the different categories of data. And again, this is going to be involving a bit of writing, so write these definitions down as we go. So the first one is variable. So in statistics, a variable is something measurable or observable, okay, I'll underline that is expected to change over time. So it's expected to change over time or between individual observations. Now these variables can be either numerical or categorical. So firstly, write down that definition of variable, and now we're going to look at the different categories that they can put in. Now the two categories that they can be put into is numerical and categorical. Now there are two types of numerical data, which can be discrete. Okay, it can be discrete numerical or continuous numerical. Now the first thing you should think about is that numerical data, the first part of that word basically looks like a number, and that's effectively what it means. It means number. So when we're looking at data and it involves numbers, that's numerical data. And it can be classified into these two separate parts. So discrete numerical, so that is data that can only be particular numerical values. So example, the number of TV sets in a house. So you can only have, 0, 1, 2, 3. You can't have something like 1.3125. So whole numbers, etc., are discrete numerical. That's what those definitions mean. Now the other numerical types of data you can have is continuous. Now obviously this is going to be the opposite to whole numbers. So this can be data that can take any value in a range. Now these can be things such as heights, weights, and temperatures, and they're all continuous numerical. So someone could have a height of 172 centimeters, could be 172.4, could be 172.215 centimeters. That's continuous numerical. The other category that we can put it into is categorical. Categorical data is that data that are not numerical, so it can be things such as like your favorite color, gender, brand of cars are all examples of categorical data. And also in a survey, categorical data comes from answers which are given as words. Okay, so think of it as numerical are numbers, categorical, the answer is words. Now I drew this little flowchart here to help you sort of understand in a bit more detail. Whenever we have data, okay, we usually separate it into the three parts. The two parts, so we have categorical, which we know are words, and then we also have numerical, which can be then broken down into discrete and continuous, and these are obviously going to be numbers. So make sure you have that information written down, and now you need to write these following definitions down as well. Data can be collected from primary or secondary sources. I want you to write the definition here for primary source, and I want you to also write the definition for secondary source. So data from a primary source of first-hand information collected from the original source by the person or organizations needing the data. So example, a survey, an individual student conducts, or census data collected and then used by organizations, for example, the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Or we've got the secondary data, which has been collected, published, and summarized by someone else before we use it. So it's not actually the first hand. And we've done this a little bit in history, etc., but it's important we understand how this is collected. The other thing, in definitions, you need to make sure you know the difference between census and a sample. So when an entire population, for example, a maths class, all the cars in a parking lot at a company, or a whole country is surveyed, it's called a census. Okay, so the census is when a whole population is surveyed. Now in Australia we have a census every 5 years, so your parents would have done a census just recently. So it's where we collect all the data from everyone in Australia and then we can make decisions based on this. This is called a census. But then within that, when a subset of the population is surveyed, it's called a sample. So samples should be randomly selected and large enough to represent the overall population. So make sure you know the difference between census and sample. And then from there, make sure you also know the definition of observation. So read through that, write that definition down, and then we'll continue on from there. So now we want to look at some worked examples. So putting all this information together, let's see if we can actually answer some questions. Now the first one here is, can you classify the following variables as categorical, discrete numerical, or continuous numerical? So the first one here we have is the gender of a newborn baby, and B here is the length of a newborn baby. Now again, remember we have the different categories and we're going to use this flowchart as an example. So remember when we have categorical, it is words, and when we have numerical, it is numbers. So question A was the gender of a baby. The answer is either going to be male or female, so it's going to be in words. So A, we know, will be categorical. And therefore for B, the length of a newborn baby. So the answer would be probably within centimeters, so it's going to be a number. So it's going to be numerical. Now is it going to be discrete or continuous? So remember, discrete means whole numbers and continuous can mean a whole range of different variables. So in this case, length usually measured in centimeters, it could be 30.5 centimeters. So in this case, it's going to be continuous numerical. So the answer for B here is continuous numerical. Now as we move over to the other side here, we want to do these ones based on primary and secondary sources. Which would be the best method to collect data in these two instances? Average income of Australian households, A, or B, the favourite washing powder or liquid for households in Australia. So it's either going to be a primary source we use or a secondary source. Now the first one here is the average income of Australian households. So this is going to be data collected over the entire population, so it's going to be census data. And we know that the Australian Bureau of Statistics every 5 years collect this information. So they hand out the census which has all this data. So this is going to be a primary source because it actually comes straight from those interviews or the collection of data. So the best way to find this information is to look at the census data which is created from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which is a primary source. The second one here is the favourite washing powder or liquid for households in Australia. Now the census doesn't collect data like that, so if you want to get primary source in this case, you need to actually interview all the households in Australia, which really can't be done. So the best way to do this would probably use secondary source. So that's doing some research and getting second-hand information to so you can work out the answer for that one. So it's not using the primary source, it'll be using a secondary source as the best form of information. So if we scroll back now, make sure you look that you understand those KUDs, you understand those definitions, you know how to classify data, and you also understand that there are different types of data. So the next video we'll look at now actually getting into how we can gather the data and interpret it. Thanks guys.